I remember the day I pulled into that neighborhood like it was yesterday. The sun was barely dipping below the horizon, streaks of orange and pink painting the sky, when my truck rumbled up the long street lined with neatly trimmed hedges and cookie-cutter houses. You know the kind of neighborhood I'm talking about. The ones where every lawn looks like it came out of a catalog, where the houses seem almost identical, and where people smile too wide when they wave at you. Yeah, that kind of neighborhood. To be honest, I was exhausted. I'd just finished a brutal week of travel, long nights, and more coffee than anyone should ever admit to drinking. All I wanted was to park, stretch my legs, and finally relax in the house I'd recently closed on. It was supposed to be my new quiet place, away from the chaos of work. I didn't even have my boxes unpacked yet. This was my first real night here. But you know how life works, right? The moment you let your guard down, that's when the storm rolls in. So there I was, hauling my last bag out of the truck bed, when I noticed a woman standing across the street. She was tall, probably mid-50s, with short blonde hair cut into one of those sharp bobs that almost seemed designed to scream in charge. She wore a blazer even though it was pushing 80 degrees outside, and she held a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. Her eyes locked on me like a hawk spotting prey. At first, I tried to ignore it. I figured maybe she was just one of those overly curious neighbors sizing up the new guy. No big deal, right? Everyone's a little nosy when someone new moves in. But then, just as I bent down to grab another duffel bag, I heard the sharp clack of heels crossing the pavement. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice clipped, authoritative, like she was summoning a student to the principal's office. I turned, half expecting her to say, "Welcome to the neighborhood," or something halfway polite. But no, that would have been too easy. "You can't park there," she said, pointing to my own driveway. I blinked. This is my driveway." Her eyes narrowed. "Not until your residency is formally approved. There are procedures here. You'll need to park on the street until the HOA reviews your file." I almost laughed. Was this woman serious? I'd just signed the closing papers less than a week ago. The ink on the contract was still fresh. I owned this house. But here she was, standing there like some self-appointed sheriff, trying to tell me where I could and couldn't park. "Ma'am," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, "I don't think you understand. This is my property. My name is on the deed. I don't need approval to park in my own driveway." Her lips pursed into the thinnest line I've ever seen. She scribbled something on her clipboard, then looked back up. "New residents are required to undergo an orientation and compliance review. Until then, you are not permitted to access certain areas, including driveways and garages. It's in the bylaws." Now here's the thing. You might be wondering why I didn't just shut her down right there and storm inside. But what you don't know yet is this. I already knew exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. You see, I hadn't moved in blind. I'd done my homework on this HOA. I knew their president, this woman in front of me, as it turned out, was notorious for playing power games with new homeowners. She thrived on intimidation, on bending the rules just enough to make you feel powerless. What she didn't know? I wasn't some clueless newcomer. I had leverage, big leverage. But in that moment, I decided to play along, at least a little. Sometimes it's better to let people think they've got you cornered, so you can watch them overplay their hand. "All right," I said, raising my hands like I was surrendering. "If that's the rule, then I guess I'll move my truck." Her expression softened, just a fraction. She clearly thought she'd won that round. "Good. We like compliance here. You'll find things run much smoother if you cooperate." She spun on her heel and marched back across the street, probably to jot down more notes on her precious clipboard. I slid behind the wheel of my truck, but instead of pulling onto the street, I just sat there for a moment. My fingers tapped the steering wheel. My gut told me this wasn't a one-off interaction. No, this was the opening move of a much bigger game. And I was right. About 15 minutes later, after I'd hauled the rest of my bags inside, I heard another knock at the door. Sharp. Impatient. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Sure enough, Clipboard Lady was back, this time with two other people trailing behind her, a tall man in khakis with a tucked-in polo shirt and a woman wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun had long set. They all looked like they'd stepped straight out of an HOA board meeting brochure. "Mr. Daniels?" she asked, her tone syrupy but cold. I nodded. "That's me. We're here to conduct your initial inspection. As per HOA regulations, new residents must allow board members to review the condition of the property upon move-in. It's standard procedure. Now, let me pause here. Imagine you've just moved into your new home, you're bone-tired, and three strangers show up demanding to inspect your property like they own it. Would you let them in? Because I'll tell you right now, most people would cave. They'd assume this is just some weird rule, and they'd go along with it to avoid conflict. But me? I just leaned against the doorframe and smiled. Inspection, huh? That's interesting, because my realtor never mentioned anything about that. And I've read through every page of the bylaws. Twice. Funny, I don't remember seeing that requirement anywhere. Clipboard lady blinked just for a second before recovering her composure. It's an addendum. Not everyone has access to the most current documents. Ah, I said. So it's a secret rule. That's convenient. The man in khakis shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the woman in sunglasses. For the first time, I noticed a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They weren't used to someone challenging them this directly. "Look," Clipboard lady said, her patience thinning. "You'll find that cooperation goes a long way here. We don't like troublemakers." I tilted my head, keeping my voice even. "Neither do I." Then I slowly closed the door in their faces. That was the first battle. But trust me, it was only the beginning. As I sat on my couch later that night, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, I couldn't help but laugh to myself. These people had no idea who they were messing with. They thought I was just another homeowner they could bully, another easy mark they could find for imaginary violations. But here's the twist they didn't see coming. This neighborhood, these houses, this entire subdivision, I wasn't just a new resident. I was also the person who owned the land beneath their feet. The one collecting rent checks from the very board members who had just tried to boss me around. And if they wanted to play games, well, they were about to learn I always play to win. The morning after that little showdown at my front door, I woke up to the sound of lawnmowers humming in the distance and sprinklers ticking like clockwork. For a moment, I almost let myself believe it was just another peaceful Saturday in the suburbs. My coffee machine gurgled, birds chirped outside, and the golden sunlight filtered through the blinds. But then, I stepped onto the porch. There, pinned to my front door with a strip of blue tape, was a bright yellow notice. The words "Violation Warning" were printed in bold across the top. I didn't even have to read the rest to know where it came from. I peeled it off, scanned the paper, and nearly laughed out loud. Violation 1. Improper vehicle placement. Your vehicle was observed parked in the driveway without prior approval from the HOA board. This is a violation of Section 3, Article B, Paragraph 2. Immediate corrective action is required. Failure to comply may result in fines or further enforcement action. I glanced over at my truck, sitting exactly where it had been the night before, perfectly centered in my driveway. No oil leaks, no blocking sidewalks, nothing. The only improper thing about it was that it apparently offended the woman with the clipboard. As I folded the notice in half, I noticed movement across the street. Sure enough, Clipboard lady herself was standing on her porch, sipping from a mug and staring at me like a hawk waiting for a rabbit to twitch. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched. I raised the paper in my hand, gave her a little salute with it, then went back inside. Now, let me explain something here. HOAs like this one, they operate on fear and repetition. They throw enough notices, fines, and fake rules at you until you're too worn down to fight back. Most people just pay the fines, apologize, and try to keep their heads low. That's how the HOA keeps control. But not me. See, what Clipboard lady didn't realize was that I've spent years in real estate. I know the language, the contracts, the loopholes. And while she thought she was intimidating me, what she was really doing was handing me ammunition. So instead of getting angry, I got curious. How far would they push this? How many fake rules would they try to shove down my throat before realizing I wasn't biting? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Later that same afternoon, I heard voices outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw three board members walking slowly past my house, stopping every few feet to jot down notes. Clipboard lady was leading the pack again, of course. Grass is a quarter-inch too long, she muttered, writing furiously. Mailbox needs repainting, the man in khakis added. Curtains don't match the community's standard color palette, sunglasses lady chimed in. I almost choked on my water. Curtains. They were inspecting my curtains. The audacity was almost impressive. I waited until they were halfway down the block before I stepped outside, leaning casually against the railing of my porch. "Hey there, neighbors," I called out, grinning. They froze like kids caught sneaking cookies from the jar. Clipboard lady turned slowly, plastering on that fake smile she probably practiced in the mirror. "Good afternoon, Mr. Daniels. We're conducting a routine neighborhood walkthrough. Ensuring compliance keeps our community beautiful." "Oh, I get it," I said, nodding. "Gotta keep those curtains regulation beige, right?" The man in khakis coughed into his fist, clearly embarrassed. Sunglasses lady looked away. But clipboard lady? She didn't flinch. "That's correct," she said evenly. "Window treatments must be within the approved spectrum. Yours appear to be slightly outside compliance. You'll receive formal notice soon." I laughed. Not the kind of laugh you give when something's funny, the kind you give when someone's testing your patience but you know they've already lost the game. "Perfect," I said. "Send me all the notices you want. I love paperwork." Her smile faltered for just a second, just enough for me to see the crack in her armor. By the time evening rolled around, I had 3 more violation slips taped to my door. One for grass length, one for curtain color, and, my personal favorite, one for front porch railing not matching community aesthetic. I sat at my dining table with the stack of papers spread out in front of me. To most people, it would look like a nightmare, a pile of petty fines and endless headaches. But to me, it looked like an opportunity. Because here's the thing. Every single violation notice had a code, a section, and a paragraph number listed. And every single one was fake. Completely fabricated. The bylaws I'd studied didn't even have half of the sections they were citing. They weren't just bending the rules, they were making them up out of thin air. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about me. If they were this bold on my very first day, how many other families had they pulled this stunt on? How many people had paid fines for rules that didn't even exist? It wasn't just a power trip. It was a racket. The next morning, I decided to test my theory. I took a walk around the neighborhood, casual as could be, and started chatting with people. First, I met an older couple watering their roses. Sweet folks, probably in their 70s. When I asked how long they'd lived here, they sighed. "Oh, about 8 years now. Lovely place, but the hoe can be a bit strict." I pushed a little. "Strict how?" The wife glanced nervously toward the street before whispering. "Last year, they fined us $150 for having a bird feeder." Said it attracted non-native species. Can you imagine? A bird feeder. $150. I thanked them, shook my head, and kept walking. Next, I ran into a young mom wrangling 2 toddlers in her driveway. She looked exhausted. When I mentioned the hoe, her eyes rolled so hard I thought she'd hurt herself. "They fined us for sidewalk chalk," she said. "My kids were drawing hopscotch squares. Apparently, it was graffiti. I paid just to make them go away. Sidewalk chalk. From children." By the time I'd made it halfway around the block, I'd heard at least half a dozen horror stories. Fines for Christmas lights. Fines for basketball hoops. Fines for planting the wrong kind of flowers. It was a pattern. A scam dressed up as community standards. And now they thought they could pull the same stunt on me. That evening, right on cue, clipboard lady showed up again. This time she didn't bother knocking. She simply stood at the edge of my driveway, holding a fresh notice in her hand, waiting for me to come out. So I did. "Another one already?" I asked, crossing my arms. She held the paper out like it was a badge of honor. "Yes." trash bins visible from the street. That's a violation. I glanced over at my bins, neatly tucked against the side of the garage, barely visible unless you craned your neck. Funny, I said, taking the paper, because I read the bylaws again this morning, and there's no mention of that. Want to point me to the exact section? Her lips pressed together. She didn't answer. Instead, she pivoted. You seem resistant to following rules, Mr. Daniels. That's not a good look for new residents. The board may need to escalate enforcement if this continues. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Escalate all you want. Just remember, every piece of paper you hand me is one more piece of evidence in a growing pile. And piles tend to get heavy. Her eyes flickered. Just for a moment. But I saw it. Doubt. Then she spun on her heel and marched away without another word. I stood there, watching her retreat, and felt something shift. The game had officially started. They wanted to bury me in fake rules and bogus fines. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a case. A case that would expose everything they'd been doing to this neighborhood. And when the time was right, I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to flip the whole board. By the time the third day rolled around, my welcome package from the HOA had grown into a stack of violation slips thick enough to rival a phone book. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. My porch light was too bright. My front door color was non-compliant. And, my personal favorite, my grass allegedly posed a safety hazard. A safety hazard. I sat at my dining room table, sipping coffee, staring at the papers, and finally said out loud, "All right, enough's enough." I wasn't just going to sit back and let them bury me in nonsense. It was time to push back. That afternoon, I made my first move. I walked down to the HOA office, which was housed in a converted model home at the edge of the subdivision. It looked like any other house from the outside, but when I stepped in, the living room had been turned into a makeshift administrative center. A long folding table with plastic chairs, a printer humming in the corner, and of course, a giant corkboard covered in flyers about community rules and events. Behind the table sat clipboard lady herself, along with khaki man and sunglasses woman. The board. The moment I stepped in, all three heads turned like I just wandered into enemy territory. "Mr. Daniels," clipboard lady said, her voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here?" I dropped the stack of violation notices onto the table with a loud thud. "These," I said. She blinked, clearly not expecting me to walk in so boldly. "Yes, those are your notices. As a new resident, it's important to save it." I cut her off. "I've read every page of the bylaws. Twice. None of these are real. Half the sections you're quoting don't even exist. So I'm here to ask a very simple question. Do you make these up as you go? Or do you have a dartboard in the back with random rules written on it?" Khaki man shifted uncomfortably, but clipboard lady's smile never wavered. "I assure you, these are valid regulations. Perhaps you have an outdated copy of the bylaws." "Funny," I said, pulling out my phone, "because I downloaded them straight from the county records office yesterday. Unless you're suggesting the county clerk has an outdated copy, I'd say I have the most current version." That hit a nerve. Sunglasses lady lowered her shades just enough for me to catch her eyes widening. Clipboard lady, though, she doubled down. "Regardless, you are expected to comply. Failure to do so will result in escalating fines, potential liens, or even foreclosure proceedings. That's how it works here." She said it like she was dropping a hammer, like those words were supposed to scare me into submission. But here's the part she didn't know. I wasn't the one who should have been scared. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "You might want to rethink threatening foreclosure, because if you actually tried it, you'd be in for a nasty surprise. See, I don't just own my house here. I own several properties in this community. In fact, a few of your board members are my tenants. And last I checked, none of you are current on rent." The silence that followed was so sharp you could have cut it with a knife. Khaki man's face went pale. Sunglasses lady's mouth fell open. Clipboard lady's hand tightened around her pen, knuckles white. "You're lying," she snapped. "Am I?" I asked, pulling a folded sheet of paper from my pocket. It was a copy of a rental ledger, names blacked out for privacy, but addresses listed clear as day. 3 of them matched the board members sitting in front of me. The color drained from clipboard lady's face. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked rattled. You can't bring personal matters into whole business, she stammered. Oh, I can, I said, sliding the paper back into my pocket. Because here's the thing. If you're going to play hardball with me, I'll play harder. You want to bury me in fake fines? I'll bury you in eviction notices. And I guarantee the county judge cares a lot more about unpaid rent than about whether my porch railing matches your idea of pretty. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked out, leaving the stack of fake violations on the table behind me. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time since this circus started, I'd seen fear in their eyes. And fear in people like that means only one thing. They know they've been caught. But I also knew something else. Cornered animals don't back down quietly. They fight harder, dirtier. And I had just cornered the biggest animal of them all. Sure enough, that night the retaliation began. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting in my living room when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a city code enforcement officer standing there, clipboard in hand. Evening, he said. Got a report about unpermitted construction on this property. I raised an eyebrow. Unpermitted construction? I moved in 2 days ago. What construction? He frowned, flipping through his notes. Says here, unauthorized deck extension. I stepped outside and gestured around. Do you see a deck? Because unless my lawn chair counts as an extension, I think you've been misinformed. The officer looked embarrassed. Mind if I take a quick look around just to check? Go ahead, I said. He walked the perimeter of the house, checked the backyard, then returned shaking his head. Yeah, there's nothing here. Sorry to bother you. Someone must have filed a false report. I didn't have to guess who that someone was. Clipboard lady had called in the cavalry. The next morning, it was the fire department. Then the county health inspector. Then animal control, claiming they'd received a report about dangerous pets on the premises. Each time, I cooperated fully. Each time, the inspectors left shaking their heads, muttering about wasting taxpayer resources. By the end of the 3rd day, I had a stack of official paperwork proving every report was unfounded. And I made sure to keep every single one of them. Because while clipboard lady thought she was burying me in trouble, what she didn't realize was that she was handing me a trail of evidence. A paper trail that proved harassment. But I wasn't done pushing back. Not even close. That weekend, I hosted a barbecue. Nothing fancy, just burgers, hot dogs, a cooler of sodas. I invited the neighbors I'd spoken to earlier, plus anyone else who looked curious enough to stop by. Within an hour, my backyard was buzzing with conversation, laughter, and the smell of grilled food. And here's the thing. Once people relaxed, they started talking. Really talking. One neighbor shared how the HOA had fined her $200 for leaving her Christmas lights up past January 5th. Another admitted he'd been forced to remove a small shed from his backyard, even though it was completely within zoning codes. Someone else whispered that clipboard lady had a habit of targeting new families until they either moved out or donated to the HOA's mysterious Community Improvement Fund. It all added up to a pattern. A scheme. And the more stories I heard, the more determined I became. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about an entire neighborhood being held hostage by a handful of bullies with clipboards. And I was the one person willing to fight back. As the sun set and the last guests drifted home, I stood in my backyard, staring at the glowing windows of the houses around me. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I'd started. This wasn't just pushback. This was war. And the HOA had no idea what was coming next. After that barbecue, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Before, people would wave politely, but keep their heads down. They'd rush back inside if clipboard lady appeared, almost like kids scattering when the teacher walks into the room. But after that night in my backyard, after the beers, the burgers, and the whispered stories, folks started lingering longer on the sidewalks. They smiled more. They looked me in the eye instead of at the ground. It was small, but it was change. And clipboard lady noticed. Oh, she noticed. The first escalation came the very next morning. I woke up to the sound of a tow truck. I rushed outside barefoot, coffee mug in hand, and there it was, my truck being hauled up onto the flatbed. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting down the driveway. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The driver barely looked at me. "HOA order. Vehicle non-compliant." "Non-compliant how?" I demanded. He shrugged. "Just got the paperwork. Says it's an eyesore. An eyesore." My truck was a 3-year-old Ford, spotless, no dents, no leaks. The only eyesore about it was probably that clipboard lady had to look at it every day. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "You're trespassing on private property. That's my truck in my driveway, and you've got no legal right to touch it. Unless you've got a court order in your hand, you're committing theft." The driver hesitated. He muttered something under his breath, then slowly lowered the truck back down. "Talk to your hoe," he said, climbing into his cab. "I'm just the driver." And just like that, he was gone. I stood there fuming, but I wasn't surprised. Clipboard lady had gone from bogus fines to full-blown intimidation. If she couldn't scare me with paper, she was going to try with muscle. She had no idea that move had just backfired. Later that day, I marched over to the HOA office again, cameras still rolling. Clipboard lady was sitting behind the folding table, flipping through a binder, when I pushed open the door. "Morning," I said cheerfully. "Just wanted to drop by and thank you for the attempted theft this morning." Her head snapped up, eyes flashing. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, don't play dumb," I said, holding up my phone. "Tow truck. My driveway. Your paperwork." Lucky for me, I caught the whole thing on video, including the driver admitting it was an HOA order. Khaki man and sunglasses lady exchanged nervous glances, but clipboard lady's expression stayed icy. "You can't prove that was authorized by us," she said. "Can't I?" I scrolled through my phone and hit play. The driver's voice echoed through the room. "HOA order. Vehicle non-compliant." Her jaw tightened. "You're overstepping," she snapped. "Your behavior is becoming disruptive to the community. If you continue, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to legal action." I leaned across the table, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Good. Please do. Because the moment you file anything in court, your fake violations and harassment become a matter of public record. And something tells me the county judge won't look too kindly on your little power games." For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving her seething in silence. But the war was far from over. That evening, I discovered my mailbox had been stuffed, absolutely jammed, with whole letters. 24 envelopes, all stamped urgent. I carried the pile inside, dumped it on the table, and opened a few at random. Each one was a new violation notice. My grass, my blinds, my trash bin, my fence, even my welcome mat. And then I found the kicker. Final warning. Continued noncompliance may result in fines exceeding $5,000 and legal foreclosure proceedings. I laughed, out loud. Foreclosure. On day 4 of living here. They weren't even pretending to follow the rules anymore. The next day, they escalated again. This time, they sent in reinforcements. I was outside watering my lawn when 2 men in security uniforms walked up. Not police uniforms, private security. Big guys, sunglasses, arms crossed. "Sir," one of them said, "we're here to notify you that you're under HOA investigation. Until matters are resolved, you're prohibited from using community facilities." I set the hose down slowly, water pooling at my feet. "Facilities? You mean the pool and the park?" "That's correct," the second one said. "Failure to comply may result in fines and further action." I raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly hired you to?" "The HOA." The first man replied flatly. I pulled out my phone again. "Cool. Then I'll need your business cards for my records, because when I file my harassment complaint with the county, I want to make sure I've got everyone's names spelled correctly." The men exchanged looks. Then, without another word, They turned and walked away. I shook my head. Clipboard lady was running out of tricks, and it showed. But the escalation didn't stop there. That night, I noticed something strange. My porch light flickered. Then my living room lights dimmed. For a moment, I thought it was just a power surge. But then I saw it. A shadowy figure across the street crouched near the utility box. I stormed outside, phone light in hand, and the figure bolted. I couldn't make out their face, but I caught enough to know it was one of the HOA board members. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were tampering with my utilities. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a petty power struggle. It was sabotage. The next morning, I started documenting everything. I set up cameras around my property. I photographed every violation notice. I printed every email. I logged every bogus inspection and false report. And then I started talking to more neighbors. The stories I heard made my situation look tame. One guy told me the HOA had threatened to fine him $10,000 because his daughter's birthday party created excessive noise. Another family said they were fined for improper holiday decor because their wreath had red ribbons instead of gold. But the worst came from an elderly widow at the end of the street. She admitted, with tears in her eyes, that she'd been paying special assessments directly to Clipboard Lady for years, cash under the table, just to avoid harassment. That was it. That was the smoking gun. It wasn't just abuse of power anymore. It was extortion. By the end of that week, I knew what had to be done. Clipboard Lady wanted to escalate? Fine. I'd escalate too. But not with more words or arguments. Not with shouting matches in driveways or stacks of ignored notices. I was going to hit her where it hurt the most. Her authority. Her reputation. And most of all, her wallet. Because while she was busy dreaming up fake rules to control me, I was quietly building something much stronger. A case that would dismantle her entire little empire. And when the time came to flip the board, she wouldn't even see it coming. Once you flip one small pebble in a still pond, the ripples always reach farther than you expect. After the sabotage, after the tow truck, and the phony inspectors, the neighborhood stopped pretending nothing was wrong. People who used to duck their heads when Clipboard Lady walked by started making excuses to linger on their porches. Cars slowed. Conversations that used to be polite and guarded took on a hushed edge, like we were all sharing secrets in a church confessional. I'd expected some pushback. I hadn't expected the flood. It started slow, the way a storm starts, tiny drops, a distant rumble. The first real confession came from Mrs. Alvarez, the woman with the roses I'd met on day 2. She caught me on my way back from the hardware store, arms full of paint, and pulled me into her driveway like she couldn't wait a second longer. "You're doing more than just moving in, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. "Depends on what you mean," I said, tucking a small bag of nails under my arm. She looked at me, then around as if to make sure the whole street wasn't eavesdropping. The roses trembled in the breeze behind her like they knew a secret, too. "Do you have a minute? Please. I can't tell the others." "Not yet." She led me to her back patio and put a hand over mine, like hers was an anchor. "Listen, I've been paying them for years. It takes a special kind of betrayal to watch an old woman's face crease with shame." She told me she'd been contributing to a fund Clipboard Lady managed. An envelope here, a check there, money she said was to help with community improvements. Money she assumed was legitimate because the board had asked, and because, in a small-town mindset, you pay to keep peace. "The first time I argued," she said softly, "they told me it was voluntary, but the fine started if I didn't. They said, it'll be easier if you just contribute." I paid because I was afraid. I'm not proud of it. I remember the feeling in that moment, an electric mix of rage and sorrow. Rage at the audacity. Sorrow because people had been coerced into paying off bullies just to live their lives. From there, the dam burst. Mrs. Ungwain, the mom with the toddlers, came by next, eyes hollow with exhaustion. She told me about the chalk fine. It had started as a $2 administrative fee. Then they reassessed. Then she owed a maintenance charge. The total ballooned into a shameful sum she couldn't afford. She had paid because the board sent threatening letters and because they'd made her feel like a criminal in front of other parents. A retired school teacher named Harold, white-haired and steady-handed, confessed he'd been forced to remove a small gazebo he'd built for his wife because Clipboard Lady claimed it violated a historic sightline clause that didn't exist. He'd protested, written letters, argued with the board, only to be slapped with fines until he couldn't keep up. He had a box full of printed notices. The stack was sickening. And then there were the truly devastating ones. The family who'd been threatened with foreclosure because they'd fallen behind on assessment charges that had been doubled overnight. The couple who'd lost thousands to special assessments after hypnosis-like meetings where Clipboard Lady read off a list of ominous-sounding expenses for the community's safety. The newlyweds who'd been harassed so much they'd moved away within 6 months, citing noisy neighbors and unbearable pressure on every application, code words the board used to push people out. All of these stories started to fit together like a patchwork quilt. The same names popped up again and again. Clipboard Lady's inner circle, a few cronies who seemed more than eager to levy fines and collect payments. Small favors, returned and amplified. A down payment forgiven here, an invoice waved away there, a smiling recommendation in exchange for voluntary assistance. The pattern was dizzying. As the evenings lengthened, my yard became a kind of neighborhood confessional. People came by in 2s and 3s at first, then whole clusters by the end of the week. We ate barbecue, shared beers, and took turns telling stories. I learned who loved what, who needed help with mobility, whose kid had just been accepted to college, normal human stuff. Interspersed with that were the dark disclosures, receipts, notices, names of alleged community improvements that never materialized. It was during one of these late-night gatherings that I met Detective Rivera. Nobody had called the police about this whole mess. No arrests had been made. But Rivera happened to be an old college friend of mine who'd moved into the county years ago and taken a job in municipal investigations. He'd come by after a voicemail I'd left him. "Do you have a minute? I think there's a racket." He showed up with sleep in his eyes and instant focus in his stance. One look at the pile of violation slips and the ledger printouts, and he stopped smiling. "Harassment, extortion, maybe fraud," he said bluntly after an hour of reading. "You've got victims and a paper trail. That's the thing, paper is your friend. It's time you stop fighting these small battles alone." I'd been planning to do that anyway, but hearing it from someone who understood legal knobs and prosecutorial appetite changed everything. "You can't file a complaint and expect the world to restart," he warned, "but you can build a case. Start with statements. Signed. Notebooks. Dates. Witnesses. Keep everything in triplicate." We began the process immediately. I bought binders. We made templates for sworn statements, clear, bullet-pointed timelines. I visited every house that would open its door. I sat down with folks who had been too scared to speak earlier. We recorded audio. I took photos of mailboxes stuffed with notices, of plastic chairs where inspectors claimed there were structures, of crooked measuring marks the board used as evidence. I photocopied rent ledgers and bank withdrawal slips. I logged dates and times of every board meeting observed by witnesses. It was the thorough, boring, bureaucratic work that turns rumors into proof. And as the evidence accumulated, something else happened. People who had been silent for months came forward. The young couple who had moved away. They met me for coffee and handed over an extent of emails where Clipboard Lady had demanded a donation to an account that had no clear nonprofit trace. A neighbor, a quiet guy who kept to himself, produced bank statements showing an annuity deposit every month into an account tied to community improvements, aka Clipboard Lady's account. We matched invoice numbers with receipts for work never done. The inconsistencies were staggering. We also discovered a pattern in the inspections. They'd request to inspect a house, find a violation, and then privately offer relief if the resident donated to the fund or paid a reduced settlement fee. Once you paid, the notices disappeared. Refuse and the fines would escalate. If you really resisted, they began the phony reports. Unsafe deck, health hazard, unpermitted construction. Always something that could be made to sound scary to the average homeowner. Always someone in the inner circle ready to sign a complaint. It wasn't community management. It was criminal enterprise disguised in a cardigan. At a neighborhood potluck one Sunday, I asked for a show of hands for anyone who had ever paid a special assessment in cash. Hands went up like a wave. We collected names, dates, amounts. Some amounts were paltry, $50, $100, paid out of embarrassment. Others were horrifying, thousands paid in panic when fines threatened to engulf a household. One widow, clutching a tissue, admitted she paid monthly because she was told her home was at risk if she didn't. She'd paid for 5 years. 5 years of hush money. It's one thing to suspect, another to be handed the ledger proving it. With an armful of signed statements and a binder thick with copies, I called a lawyer. I chose someone practical, a local attorney who handled civil matters and had a reputation for cutting through noise. He read the first packet I gave him, then leaned back in his chair and said 3 words that made all of us breathe a little easier. "We can stop them." He explained the path. Formal complaints filed with the county for extortion and fraud, a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty, requests for criminal investigation if the evidence warranted it. He told us what to expect: defamation claims, obfuscation, the kind of ugly litigation designed to bleed the complainant dry. But he also told us what I already knew. Once you bring the receipts, you're no longer shouting into a void. We did something else too. We started creating a neighborhood committee, an organic, informal alliance at first, just folks who wanted to know their rights and support each other. We called meetings in my garage or on stoops. We taught each other how to request records, how to file freedom of information queries, how to log interactions with the board in a way that could be admissible in court. People who had felt isolated suddenly found neighbors who would drive them to the bank and testify on their behalf. Clipboard Lady tried to spin it the way bullies always do. She put up a post on the community board, one of those glossy, moralizing missives about unity and respect. She played the part of the offended, reciting a laundry list of vague accusations about disruptive elements trying to undermine our neighborhood. It was laughable, and the timing made it worse. We posted the real meeting minutes and receipts on an unofficial page we made, and the community responded by showing up to the next home meeting in numbers that took the room by surprise. That meeting was a turning point. They'd been used to empty chairs and nodding heads. The board had a microphone and a veneer of authority. We had a binder of sworn statements and 27 neighbors in the room, many of them ready to speak. Clipboard Lady started with her usual platitudes, but when the floor opened, the quiet of the room changed into a roar of truth. One by one, people stood to speak, soft at first, then steadier. 5 minutes of testimony turned into 20. Names were named. Dates were fixed. A young mom stood and read her child's chalk fine. She read the letter aloud, the one that started as $20 and ended at $600. A man in his 50s showed bank statements proving the special assessment deposits into an account with Clipboard Lady's initials. She stumbled. Her composure began to crack. When she finally rose to defend herself, it sounded rehearsed, like someone reciting lines they'd told themselves all along. "We have always acted in the community's best interest," she said, voice taut. "Any claims of misconduct are unfounded." Detective Rivera, who, as it turned out, had been quietly running preliminary inquiries, stood and announced to the packed room that the county had opened an investigation into irregular financial transactions tied to the HOA. You could feel the current shift. What had once been a claustrophobic little kingdom now had a spotlight on it. People were no longer afraid to ask hard questions. After the meeting, Clipboard Lady locked eyes with me for the first time and smiled in a way that wasn't kindly. It was a threat. But when I looked back, I didn't see fear. I saw resolve, mine, and the neighborhood's. Standing there in the parking lot as people trickled out, shaking hands and trading numbers, I realized the truth. When you give people the facts, they don't retreat. They rally. By the end of part 5 of this fight, we had more than just testimony. We had momentum. We had names and dates and a prosecutor's interest. People who had been beaten down for years started to breathe a little easier. They talked about gardens they'd like to plant, porches they'd repaint, the little league games they'd bring to the park next spring. Small things, ordinary things. The things the hoe had been using as leverage to run a racket suddenly felt precious again. There was danger ahead. There always is when bullies feel their power slipping. But for the first time since I'd driven up that street with boxes in my truck, I slept without someone's shadow hovering over my porch. The secrets had been told, and once a secret is out, it can't easily be shoved back into the dark. The letter taped to my door didn't scare me the way the board must have hoped it would. If anything, it sharpened my resolve. That crude message told me everything I needed to know. They were rattled. People in power don't waste time writing anonymous threats unless the ground beneath them is starting to crack. By then, we had binders of evidence stacked in my living room like bricks in a fortress. Statements, receipts, photos, recordings, every piece of harassment documented in triplicate. Neighbors had gone from whispering in private to speaking openly, no longer afraid of Clipboard Lady and her little kingdom. The tide had turned, but tides alone don't bring justice. To make this stick, we needed the law on our side. That's when the lawyers came in. I'd hired a local attorney who had no love for hoe nonsense. The kind of guy who wore scuffed shoes into a courtroom because he spent more time working than polishing. He flipped through our files with a growing grin, nodding to himself as he connected the dots. "You've got fraud here," he said finally. "Extortion, harassment, abuse of authority. And with this many victims willing to testify, you've got a case." Hearing those words lit a fire in all of us. For the first time, this wasn't just about surviving. It was about winning. We filed formal complaints with the county. Rivera, who had been careful not to blur his professional boundaries until the timing was right, quietly ensured those complaints landed on the right desks. Investigators started asking questions. Subpoenas went out. The Hoe Board, which had operated like an untouchable club for years, suddenly found itself under scrutiny from people with real power. The board's reaction was almost comical. They tried to spin it as a witch hunt, a conspiracy led by a disgruntled resident who didn't understand community spirit. They held a meeting where Clipboard Lady, voice shaking but eyes still sharp, declared that outside forces were trying to destroy everything they had built. But fewer people were clapping. The room wasn't with her anymore, and she knew it. Then came the day we'd all been waiting for, the day in court. The courthouse wasn't glamorous. Fluorescent lights, polished floors, the faint smell of paper and coffee lingering in the air. But to us, it might as well have been a battlefield. We filled 2 rows of benches, neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder, each one carrying years of frustration and fear finally ready to boil over. The board sat across from us, stiff and silent. Clipboard Lady had traded her blazer for a tailored suit, trying to look every bit the respectable leader. Her cronies flanked her, eyes darting, papers clutched in sweaty hands. For once, their clipboards didn't give them any power. Our attorney went first. He spoke clearly, methodically, walking the judge through the evidence like a teacher explaining a simple equation. He laid out the bogus fines, the cash payments funneled into private accounts, the intimidation tactics. He read statements aloud: Mrs. Ongwane's chalk fine, Harold's demolished gazebo, the widow's years of hush payments. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the scratching of pens on legal pads. When it was their turn, the board's lawyer tried to twist everything. He called it miscommunication, overzealous enforcement, a misunderstanding of bylaws. He painted Clipboard Lady as a devoted volunteer doing her best for an ungrateful neighborhood. But the evidence was too solid, the stories too many, the victims too real. Every excuse sounded hollow in that room. The moment that stuck with me most was when Mrs. Alvarez, hands trembling but voice steady, stood and spoke. "For years I paid because I was afraid. Afraid they would take my home. Afraid they would ruin me. I am not afraid anymore." Those words landed like a hammer. By the time closing arguments wrapped, it wasn't just about one hoe. It was about the principle of ordinary people standing up to abuse. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. These things take time. but the board walked out looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. Their shoulders hunched, their confidence cracked. Clipboard lady avoided eye contact completely. We spilled out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, neighbors hugging, laughing, some even crying. For once, we weren't just reacting to what the board had done to us. We were writing our own future. But even in that victory, I knew it wasn't over. People like Clipboard Lady don't vanish quietly. They plot, they maneuver, they look for cracks to slip back through. The difference now was that the whole neighborhood was awake. No more whispers, no more silence. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a fight to the finish, and for the first time, the board was the one on defense. The courthouse felt heavier that morning, like the building itself understood what was at stake. Rows of pew-like benches filled quickly, not just with neighbors, but with curious reporters, people from nearby communities, even a handful of strangers who had heard whispers about a homeowners association being dragged into court by its own residents. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It had become a spectacle. We gathered together in the front rows, united not only by proximity, but by shared scars. I looked around at faces I had come to know in ways I never expected. Mrs. Ongwain with her quiet resilience, Harold with his stubborn defiance, Mrs. Alvarez with her strength born from years of intimidation. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were comrades. Across the aisle sat the board. Clipboard Lady was there, of course, rigid and expressionless in a dark tailored suit, her ever-present tool of control nowhere in sight. To her right, two of her cronies whispered furiously to each other, while another shifted in his chair like he wanted to bolt for the door. Their arrogance had evaporated. What remained was the jittery energy of people who know the walls are closing in. The judge entered, robe flowing, papers in hand. We rose, sat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. You could hear the creak of the wood beneath us, the faint rustle of legal pets, the nervous tap of a shoe against linoleum. My heart pounded so loudly, I wondered if others could hear it. The judge cleared his throat and began. This court has reviewed the evidence presented, the testimonies of residents, and the financial records subpoenaed during the course of this case. His voice was steady, measured, but every word landed like a hammer striking stone. He walked us through it step by step. He described the fraudulent fines, charges invented out of thin air, payments collected without receipts, threats issued when residents demanded proof. He spoke of harassment, letters taped to doors, retaliatory inspections, intimidation that turned people's homes into cages. And then he addressed the money. That was the nail in the coffin. The board had siphoned thousands into private accounts under the guise of maintenance funds. The paper trail was undeniable. Every sentence the judge read tightened the noose around them. I watched Clipboard Lady's face carefully. At first, she held herself upright, shoulders back, jaw set like stone. But as the list of wrongdoings stretched on and on, the mask began to crack. Her eyes darted, her lips pursed. A muscle in her cheek twitched. For someone who had built her empire on control, this was the moment it slipped away forever. When the judge announced the ruling, time seemed to slow. The board of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. A collective gasp filled the room. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything we had dared to hope for. Restitution is to be paid to all affected residents for fraudulent fines collected over the past 7 years. Furthermore, the individuals serving on the board are barred permanently from holding any future position of authority in housing associations, community boards, or similar organizations. One of the cronies dropped his head into his hands. Another whispered something sharp to Clipboard Lady, who didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. She just stared straight ahead, as if by sheer force of will she could pretend this wasn't happening. And finally, the judge said, voice dropping slightly, "This court refers all matters of financial fraud and criminal intimidation to the district attorney for further prosecution." That was it. The death blow. The gavel came down, sharp and final. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. No one dared move. And then, it was like a dam broke. Tears, laughter, Cheers, embraces. The gallery erupted in a wave of release. Years of frustration and fear poured out all at once. People clutched each other like survivors of a storm finally stepping onto dry land. Mrs. Alvarez sobbed openly, clutching my hand and whispering, "It's over. It's finally over." Harold slapped Rivera on the back so hard the man nearly stumbled. Mrs. Ongwain buried her face in her daughter's shoulder, shaking with relief. I looked across the aisle one last time. Clipboard lady still hadn't moved. She sat frozen, her empire crumbled beneath her feet. One of her cronies had already slipped out the side door, not even waiting for the reporters closing in. Another argued loudly with his attorney, pointing fingers, blaming everyone but himself. The illusion of unity they had used to dominate us had disintegrated in an instant. As we stepped outside, the sunlight felt different. Brighter, warmer. For years we had lived in the shadows of fear and silence, but that day the sky opened wide. Reporters thrust microphones at us, asking what it felt like to beat the hoe. Some of us spoke, some of us didn't, but the truth was written on every face. We were free. The aftermath wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. Checks began arriving in mailboxes, restitution payments that, while they couldn't erase the stress, served as tangible proof that justice had teeth. For some, it meant catching up on bills. For others, it meant finally fixing things they'd been too afraid to touch under the board's watchful eye. The neighborhood began to change. Fences were painted in bright colors without permission slips. Lawns bloomed with flowers once deemed non-compliant. Kids chalked the sidewalks in rainbows and suns, no longer worrying about fines for defacement. Laughter returned to porches. Music drifted through open windows. Life, real life, had come back. We didn't form another hoe. We made that clear from the start. What we built instead was a residence council, open to everyone, transparent in every decision. No fines, no intimidation, just neighbors talking to neighbors. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. One evening, months later, we held a block party to celebrate. Tables lined the street, filled with food from every kitchen, music playing, kids running wild. I stood there watching, a plate in my hand, and thought back to the day I first arrived. The day clipboard lady tried to trick me before I even unpacked my bags. If only she had known then who she was dealing with, because she thought she was the one with power. She thought fear would keep us in line forever. But fear is brittle. Fear cracks when people stand together. And that's what we did. In the end, Clipboard Lady didn't just lose her position. She lost the illusion that she could bend people's lives to her will. Her reign ended not with more threats, but with the simple truth: ordinary people refusing to stay silent. As I looked around at my neighbors, laughing, eating, finally free, I realized this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something new. Our homes were ours again. Our voices were ours again. And no clipboard in the world could ever take that away.